show today. And now to this. Hi, everyone. I'm Brooke Baldwin. You are watching CNN on this Monday afternoon. We begin in Florida, where the campaigns are over, but the mudslinging is just getting dirtier, with Trump talking of quote-unquote infected ballots. That is because of what you are seeing. These are live pictures right now in Florida. The recount in not just one, but 3 races. U.S. Senate, governor, and the state's agriculture commissioner, the tightest of the 3. The recounts were triggered by law due to the margin of votes between the winner and the loser being less than 0.5%. Election workers have until Thursday at 3 p.m. to finish the second count. In the meantime, the lawsuits and the insults, they are flying. Florida Democrats say Republican Rick Scott, in the lead for Senate, is acting like a, quote, Latin American dictator for trying and failing to seize ballots and impound voting machines. Rick Scott, meantime, is calling his opponent, Bill Nelson, a, quote, sore loser, trying to steal the election after thousands of votes counted after Election Day narrowed Scott's lead. In the midst of all this, you have the president of the United States tweeting this, quote, the Florida election should be called in favor of Rick Scott and Ron DeSantis in that large numbers of new ballots showed up out of nowhere and many ballots are missing or forged. An honest vote count is no longer possible. Ballots massively infected must go with election night, exclamation mark. So let's start in Florida. CNN's Jessica Dean is in Lauderhill, which is in Broward County. And so, Jessica, obviously crunch time, deadline, Thursday afternoon. And it's my understanding Palm Beach County originally saying, whoa, we're not going to make it in time, at least is saying we're going to make it at least in some of the races.
Yeah. Brooke, there's just a little going on down here in Florida, so let's get you all caught up. You mentioned Palm Beach. Let's start there. You're exactly right. We heard today from the supervisor there, they have these old machines, so they were concerned they weren't going to be able to complete the recount by Thursday, and if that happens, you've got to go with your unofficial results that they turned in on Saturday. So they were concerned they weren't going to be able to do that. She's now come out and said, okay, I think we can make it through the Senate race. So they are hopeful that in Palm Beach County, they'll be able to complete the recount on the Senate race. Here in Broward County, they are making their way through the process right now. There have been a lot of lawsuits, a flurry of lawsuits surrounding all of this. And just in the last hour or so, lawyers for both sides were in a courtroom here in Broward County. Republicans were asking for additional oversight here at Broward County. Brenda Snipes, the supervisor here. Democrats saying that there was no fraud. There's no evidence of fraud. The judge saying there is indeed no evidence of fraud coming out of Broward County. The two sides compromised by bringing in 3 extra guards to monitor what's going on here as they make their way through the recount process here in Broward County. All of this sparking a lot of attention, creating a lot of attention, and drawing out a lot of protesters. It's much quieter here today on this Monday, but we were also here over the weekend, and we saw a number of protesters very animated from both sides, but a larger contingent from the Republican side, people who were yelling at Brenda Snipes' chance of lock her up and that she needs to go. But again, a little quieter today. But we've also noticed that this is, as you mentioned, gotten the attention of the president, who's been tweeting about it all weekend. And he mentioned that he wants to go with Election Day results. But, Brooke, as you noted, this is being done by law in Florida. The law being that if you're in that 0.5% margin, it automatically triggers a recount. So right now, the state of Florida is following the law. We'll see what happens on Thursday.
Jessica, thank you. It is so caustic between these two sides in Florida's contested race for U.S. Senate that a judge today directed lawyers to, quote unquote, ramp down the rhetoric. He was how tense things became when a lawyer for an election official accused the Scott campaign of filing a factually incorrect statement.
Here is the memorandum of law. For counsel to suggest that I just read that wrong and that they did not put what I read in that paper is outrageous. At the bottom of that page, they say exactly what I said. And for him to suggest he didn't say it, Judge, that's exactly
Your Honor, let's read what it's. During that same period, Dr. Snipes released thousands of additional, initially unaccounted for votes, frequently in the dead of night, with no explanation regarding her failure to account for them.
Exactly
That's not what he said. He talked about plussing in ballots.
Judge.
Have a seat. Have a seat. Have a seat. Have a seat. That's enough.
That's enough. CNN correspondent Ryan Nobles, who's been following each and every twist and turn of the Florida recount. He's live for us in Tallahassee. CNN political analyst Sungmin Kim, who is a White House reporter for the Washington Post, is with us as well. So great to see both of you. And Ryan, you have been there in the trenches. Again, you know, Trump is the one who's saying, let's go back to the election night count. But that is the count that has legally triggered precisely where they are right now.
Yeah, I mean, Brooke, you know, Jessica laid it out pretty well there. I mean, the president can say all he wants about this on his Twitter feed, but it doesn't have anything to do with what's happening here in Florida. You know, I don't think we've really focused enough on how much Florida has changed their election laws since what happened here 18 years ago during the 2000 presidential recount. They've improved their machines. They've improved the process by which they count these ballots, and they specifically have changed how they do a recount. There are specific deadlines. They are automatically triggered. No one can order those recounts to take place. There's a very simple mathematical formula. It has to be within 0.5%, and it takes place whether or not you want it to or not. The only way you can stop it is that the losing candidate has to say that they don't want the recount to go forward. So the president, frankly, just doesn't know what he's talking about in this particular circumstance, and there is no Republican or Democrat that is suggesting that the recount should not go forward. That's what's happening here behind me in Leon County in Tallahassee. They are counting these votes because that is what they are mandated to do by Florida law.
You hear all these claims, and we talked about this with your new reporting on Friday, but Sungmin, to you, you hear all these claims of fraud by Trump and the Republicans, and Rick Scott has been popping up on, Fox News mighty often. But again, there is no evidence.
There is absolutely no evidence, and the judge that ruled on Rick Scott's challenges earlier today reaffirmed that as well. You have to look at why, particularly the president, might be so aggressive in going after the vote counting in Arizona and Florida. I mean, first of all, he's done this before. At the beginning of his presidency, he asserted, again, without any sort of evidence, that there were millions of fraudulent votes in the 2016 elections,
right.
And that's why he lost the popular vote. So think about it from that sense, but also think about the fact that the Senate and the fact that Republicans were able to make gains in the Senate were, at least on election night, were Trump and Republicans' big successes in an otherwise disappointing night. And if you look at, and if you saw the president's comments in the days following the midterm elections, he kind of seemed to push aside the shellacking of sorts that he got in the House results, but again looked at the successes and the gains made in the Senate. But if you're looking at when we're going back to these results, and as the recounts and the counting of votes goes on, in the Senate, the vote, the Republican majority, it could have been high as 55 votes and 55 seats on election night. That could go pretty much as low as 52 at the end of the day, which is not a big success for President Trump and the Republican Party. So that's another way of looking at why the president has been fighting this so much. And you mentioned Rick Scott going on Fox News so much and kind of, taking on this Trumpian rhetoric.
Stirring the pot.
To the vote issue. It's just fascinating because he kind of distanced himself from President Trump during his campaign, but it's really near the end and after the elections happened that he's really kind of embracing his tactics as the president a little bit more.
Let's focus on Palm Beach County. And Ryan, I know Jessica hit on this, but, we had heard initially that they didn't think they'd make that Thursday 3 p.m. deadline. Now they do, but only for the Senate race. So then what?
Well, I think the open question there, Brooke, is, first of all, to explain what's happening in Palm Beach County, it's a little bit different than what's happening behind me here in Leon County, in that the way that their voting machines are set up, they actually have to do this recount 3 different times for all 3 individual races, the agriculture commissioner race, the governor's race, and the Senate race. But the other point I would make about that is they are expressing a lot more optimism that they can get it done in time, at least the Senate race. But this, I still think, leaves open the door that perhaps we could see some sort of lawsuit filed by the Democrats, Mark Elias, their lead lawyer here, to perhaps ask a federal judge to extend the deadline, because even if Palm Beach isn't able to do it, perhaps there's another county somewhere that runs into some sort of a problem where they can't get it done on time. Now, Florida law, we should point out, is very specific about this. You've got to get it done by 3 p.m. on Thursday. But what the Democrats may try and intervene with here is saying that the Constitution guarantees the right for these votes to be counted or recounted. My sources at this point, Brooke, are saying that Democrats are holding off on that lawsuit now. They're going to allow Palm Beach County to breathe a little bit here and try and get this done without that pressure of a lawsuit looming. But it is something to keep a very close eye on, because you know that Democrats would want to see every single vote recounted, especially in a county like Palm Beach where there is a heavy
Just deeply admire everything you do. Thank you so much for the time. I really appreciate it, and thank your families as well. Thank you. Thank you, Frank. Coming up next here on CNN, blame the weather. President Trump facing backlash after skipping an event to honor fallen American soldiers because of the rain in France. Is the criticism against the president justified? Also just in, remembering a legend, Marvel Comics co-creator Stan Lee has died. More on his life and legacy next. News in the world of Hollywood. An American icon, comic books, has passed away. Marvel Comics co-creator Stan Lee, the brains behind Spider-Man, Black Panther, the Fantastic Four, has died. He was 95, and CNN's Stephanie Elam takes a look back at his legendary writing career.
Spider-Man, Iron Man, and the X-Men. They're among the most iconic comic book heroes in history, and they simply would not exist without Stan Lee. The visionary behind Marvel Comics lived a life almost as incredible as the characters he created.
I'm pretty proud of the fact that some of the stories that I wrote so many years ago are still being read and hopefully enjoyed by the public, and people are making motion pictures based on them and television series.
Spider-Man debuted in 1962 and became Lee's most successful comic book creation.
Spider-Man is my favorite because he's the most popular and he's known and loved worldwide.
Lee's spidey senses were tingling. Years later, in 2002, the first Spider-Man film was released and was a blockbuster hit.
As a child, I didn't really know anybody who shot webs or crawled on buildings or wore suits of armor and flew or anything like that. I just imagined them, and there they were.
He also imagined Thor, the Incredible Hulk, and the Fantastic Four. They were flawed people with extraordinary powers.
I never had any idea that these characters would last this long. In fact, I and the people I worked with who co-created them with me, the many talented artists, we just hoped that the books would sell and we'd continue to get our salary and be able to pay our rent. The movies have done so much for the characters. The movies have given the comic book characters even more prestige.
The native New Yorker was born Stanley Morgan Lieber. He had humble beginnings, but his love for comics took him much farther than he ever dreamed. He also earned a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame.
In a million years, I never thought, that I'd get something like this.
As his creations became larger than life on the big screen, he also kept a feverish pace, making appearances at events like Comic-Con in San Diego.
How are you? Glad to see you.
Though his life seemed charmed, it wasn't without adversity. Lee was married to his wife Joan for over 60 years, and they had 2 daughters. However, his youngest only lived for a few days. In his 80s, Lee was involved in various lawsuits against Marvel and Disney over the span of 7 years. In September 2012, he had surgery for a pacemaker and joked he was trying to become more like his Iron Man character, Tony Stark.
To me, the most important thing in the world is to keep busy, and I'm happy to say I'm lucky enough to still be busy.
The Stan Lee Foundation was also a passion project for Lee, who seemed to believe with great power comes great responsibility.
What we concentrate on is education, educating children.
Stan Lee!
I never would have dreamed years ago that anything like this would happen.
The king of comics, who was adored worldwide, was most proud of his family and his comic heroes. Perhaps Lee will be remembered as a legendary innovator with an uncanny ability to capture the imagination.
Excelsior!
Legend Stan Lee. Coming up next, a U.S. senator in Mississippi facing heavy criticism over what she says was a joke about attending, her words, a public hanging. Her Democratic challenger, who hopes to be Mississippi's first black senator, is now responding. We'll have that story for you next. Also, a new report surfaces showing that North Korea is still working on its missile program at about a dozen hidden sites. So how does this bode for talks with the U.S.? President Trump is back home and facing criticism over his trip to France to mark 100 years since the end of World War I. The president taking heat from all sides of his decision to skip a solemn visit to honor fallen American soldiers at an American military cemetery outside of Paris, all because it was raining. The White House says the weather prevented the use of the helicopter, and they didn't want to disrupt a Saturday traffic issue with a presidential motorcade. And so the president stayed indoors. There were other world leaders who did get out and gather outside in the elements to show their respects to the millions killed in the Great War. Adding to the president's troubles, French President Emmanuel Macron appeared to rebuke President Trump and his embrace of nationalism, all as Trump sat right there.
Patriotism is the exact opposite of nationalism. Nationalism is a betrayal of patriotism. I know there are old demons which are coming back to the surface. They are ready to wreak chaos and death. History sometimes threatens to take its sinister course once again.
With me now, Commander Jeremy Butler of the U.S. Navy Reserves. He serves as the Chief Operations Officer, the IAVA, the Iraq and Afghanistan's Veterans of America. So, Commander, a pleasure. Thank you for all that you do. Your reaction to President Trump staying behind in the residence and not braving the elements Saturday?
Yeah, it was disappointing. He goes all this way to commemorate the end of World War I, and apparently a little bit of rain keeps him from honoring those that gave the ultimate sacrifice and have been laid to rest on foreign soil. It's understandable to go over there for that event and not be here in the U.S. for Veterans Day, but to then skip visiting a cemetery is a little bit of a slap in the face. It's also kind of a distraction, I think, from the larger issues of what's going on within the veteran and military community right now. Speaking of slap in the face, we just played the clip from President Macron standing there speaking about patriotism, where Trump is right there, right, this avowed nationalist. I'm just wondering, when you have a close ally, France, sitting there basically calling out the United States, what does that do to the reputation of America? I don't think it affects the reputation. I think it's raising the issue and trying to drive the point home about the importance of being engaged globally. It's kind of ironic that this is coming up at the commemoration of the end of World War I, which was literally the event that drove the U.S. in many ways to become a global power. And we're now having this debate about, our receding back into nationalism. But the fact is we have to stay engaged globally. We've got, you just teased it with the clip, we've got North Korea, looks like they're building more nuclear weapons. We've got a rising Russian military. We have China that continues to operate somewhat unopposed in the Asian waters. If we don't stay engaged globally, we're going to be overtaken. So this is how David Axelrod put it, a former Obama senior advisor. He tweeted, watching all this over the weekend, watching the events from France, I cannot recall a time when America seemed so isolated. America first feels like America alone. Are we at that point? Does it feel like America alone to you? I think it can feel that way sometimes, but you have to remember how much more is going on outside of what the president is saying and doing. Even though he might speak of nationalism, within our military, we're engaged around the world on a daily basis at levels that, most people have no idea about. We're a global military. We're underway on the waters. I was in the Navy. I'm in the Navy Reserve now. We have troops and bases around the country operating 24/7. So you have to remember that not only military, but diplomatically, we're engaged nationally and internationally, and I think we're going to stay that way. The question is, how much does our president support our efforts to continue to do so and to continue to be a player on the world stage? He says he does. He says he does, but I hear you on
words and actions.
Right.
Commander Jeremy Butler, thank you for coming by.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.
Thank you.
A U.S. senator in Mississippi makes a remark about a public hanging, and now her opponent, who is hoping to become the state's first African-American senator, is responding. We have that. Also, an air traffic controller no longer on the job after what she did for 40 minutes in the tower. Actions that completely confused the pilots. Don't miss that. Looms for a Senate seat in Mississippi, and now a racially charged comment made by the Republican incumbent has become the center of attention. Republican Senator Cindy Hyde-Smith is running against Democrat and former U.S. Secretary of Agriculture and Congressman Mike Espy, who is black. Hyde-Smith has come under intense criticism for saying this over the weekend. If he invited me to a public hanging, I'd be on the front row. Following the backlash, Hyde-Smith then released this statement. In a comment on November 2nd, I referred to accepting an invitation to a speaking engagement. In referencing the one who invited me, I used an exaggerated expression of regard, and any attempt to turn this into a negative connotation is ridiculous. Espy told CNN he found the comment tone deaf and hurtful, especially given the state's history.
Those comments that we heard that were published yesterday are very disappointing. They're hurtful and they're harmful. They're hurtful to the millions of Mississippians who are people of goodwill, and they're harmful because they tend to reinforce the stereotypes that have held back our state for so long and that have cost us jobs and have harmed our economy. I mean, this is 2018. We're going here in Mississippi into the third decade of the 21st century, and we just should not have this.
CNN did reach out to Hyde-Smith, inviting her to come on our program. We did not hear back. With me now, Nia Malika Henderson, CNN senior political reporter. And Nia, this is the South. Her opponent's black. Even if she meant no harm, what do you make of her comment?
You know, in some ways it echoes some of the comments that we've heard in some of these other races in the South. You think about some of the comments made in that Florida governor's race. You think about some of the context of that race in Georgia as well. And we see, I think, in Mississippi a similar dynamic, kind of this contest between the old South and the new South. And so I think in that context, in some ways it's not surprising. I imagine if you're Cindy Hyde-Smith, it's something that she said before. I think a lot of white Southerners oftentimes have a sort of convenient amnesia about the Southern past. And so in some ways it wasn't surprising. You saw the people there sort of clapping. Notably, she's talking about a public hanging, and public hangings were quite common in the South up into the middle part of the last century. And so, it's disturbing to hear it. In many ways, I think it brings up a past that in many ways hasn't been reckoned with, certainly by a lot of white Southerners.
I wanted to talk to you about this specifically because you traveled to Alabama this spring to see the nation's first lynching memorial. It opened in April. Here's a look.
I told my mom I was coming to Montgomery, Alabama, and I was going to go to what I told her was a lynching museum. And she said, why would they want to do that?
Yeah. I think that we have developed a really advanced coping strategy of silence. So my hope is that people will leave this space prepared to say, never again can we tolerate racial bias and bigotry anywhere. And I think if we create a consciousness like that, we can begin to expect more from our institutions, from our schools, from our system, our court system, from our elected leaders.
He's right. What was it like?
Quite moving. It's something that I had never experienced, never really grasped the magnitude of the number of lynchings that went on in the wake of Reconstruction, sort of post-Reconstruction era, up until the 1950s. And this chronicles the 4,000 or more African Americans that were lynched for infractions like walking behind a white woman. A school teacher, a woman, was lynched because she chastised a group of white school children for throwing rocks. And you also see what also happened was many African Americans fleeing the South to go up north because they were fleeing racial terror. And one of the reasons, I mean, interesting that she said the whole idea of a public lynching, because they were very public, and thousands often of white citizens, good, upstanding white citizens, at least they were thought of that way back in the day, would show up to these lynchings, take photographs, and oftentimes the bodies of these African Americans were then dragged through the African American neighborhoods as if this kind of public lynching wasn't enough to send a message. They would drag the bodies through these African American neighborhoods and oftentimes cut off the limbs of the African American victims and pass them around like souvenirs. So this is a really ugly, ugly history that museum sheds a light on. He talks about this idea of kind of confronting it and also saying never again. That is something that hasn't really happened, and that's one of the reasons I think you get these kind of casual comments about public lynchings, because the true history hasn't really been recognized. It's been sort of misremembered, I think, particularly by a lot of white Southerners. You're from the South, I'm from the South as well, and you know that African Americans and white Americans have a very different memory of the history of the American South.
We repeat his words, never again.
Right.
Nia Malika Henderson, thank you so much.
Thanks, Brooke.
Coming up next, hidden in the mountains on secret bases, what new satellite images reveal about North Korea's ballistic missile program, which appears to be very much alive and under active development. So what does the White House response to this look like? By President Trump that his negotiations with North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un are working. Commercial satellite images seem to show at least a dozen undisclosed missile sites around the country. This despite promises from Pyongyang to reduce and even dismantle its weapons production and work toward denuclearization. So with me now, David Sanger, CNN national security analyst and national security correspondent for the New York Times. David, I have your reporting here. Missile bases suggest a great deception. Tell me what you learned.
Well, the big question here, Brooke, is whether the deception is the North Koreans adding on to their existing facilities, all of which were undeclared, while dismantling one or two which President Trump has advertised, or whether the U.S., which tracks everything that's going on in North Korea so carefully, is deceiving itself. You've heard President Trump talk often about how the North Koreans are dismantling this or that. He has not talked about these dozen or more, we think up to 16 bases, including one that appears to be designed for intercontinental ballistic missiles, the kind that could reach the United States, and how those are being improved. It wouldn't seem that if you're as poor as North Korea, you would spend a lot of money improving bases that you plan to dismantle in a few months.
Right. Right. Wouldn't make sense. And it was a short 5 months ago when the world watched the big meeting between Trump and Kim in Singapore. And how would you, based upon what you know, characterize where the U.S. and North Korea relations are right now? Square one?
No, I mean, the relationship between the president and President Kim is somewhat better. I mean, I think it was a good thing to have President of the United States finally talk to a leader of North Korea. But let's not kid ourselves. The North Koreans have not done even the first steps that the United States had in mind. Those steps included just turning over a list of all of their nuclear and missile sites so that the U.S. could begin to compare what the North Koreans say they have with what the U.S. believes they had. That's the first step toward dismantlement. The North Koreans have not done that. They haven't followed through on the few cases of dismantlement that they have talked about, including one considerably large missile test site or missile engine test site. And the administration, meanwhile, has gone from saying we're very short on time to the president declaring again last week, we have plenty of time to solve this. I don't know why he thinks that. All the evidence suggests that they are continuing to add to their arsenal.
David Sanger, thank you very much.
Thank you, Brooke.
We continue on. You're watching CNN. I'm Brooke Baldwin. Thank you for being with me. This is what's going on right now in Florida, the Florida recount and the mudslinging that is getting dirtier and dirtier, with the president talking of, quote, infected ballots. The recount in not just one, but 3 races, U.S. Senate, governor and the state's agriculture commissioner, the tightest, actually, of the three. They were triggered by law because of the margin of voters between the winner and the loser being less than 0.5%. And as Florida election workers are working round the clock to recount these ballots, the lawsuits and the insults, they are flying between Republicans and Democrats. I want to play a clip for you. This is the two vying for Senate, the incumbent Democrat Bill Nelson and Republican Florida Governor Rick Scott.
Rick Scott isn't interested in making sure every lawful vote is counted. And the second is that he's using his power as governor to try to undermine the voting process.
What Bill Nelson needs to do now is what he would be asking me to do if I had lost the election, is say, look, the election happened, let's go forward. But he's not. He's just a pure sore loser trying to steal an election.
Plus, there's this tweet from the president accusing Florida election staffers of missing or forged ballots, and it ends with this quote, "An honest vote count is no longer possible. Ballots massively infected must go with election night!" Exclamation mark. Moments ago, former Trump rival and former Florida Governor Jeb Bush just said this about the election official he appointed, quote, "There is no question that Broward County Supervisor of Elections Brenda Snipes failed to comply with Florida law on multiple counts, undermining Floridians' confidence in our electoral process. Supervisor Snipes should be removed from her office following the recounts." So let's go straight to our CNN senior political analyst, Mark Preston. And Mark, what is the